Hi, guys. Welcome to the fifth episode of the MHP podcast. My name is Sarah, and I'm here today with Jacob, as always, for anybody who's new here. For today's episode, we will be talking about the secrets and some advice on supersets, some basketball conditioning advice and tips, as well as speed, agility, and quickness, specifically in football. All right, so just to get really into this episode, for the first question, what are supersets essentially? Just to start off with the basics, and why are they so used in workouts, and what are the benefits that we can actually see?
Yeah, in the simplest terms, a superset is just a pairing of two or more exercises that you do kind of in sequence.
Hmm.
And the most common way they're used and the most common benefit is that it saves you a lot of time. So instead of doing an exercise and resting and then doing your second set, you can
Hmm.
fill some of your rest time by doing something else. Um, So time saving is the most common benefit that you get from it, and it's
Right.
the main reason I use it most of the time.
Hmm.
Um, and because of this, you want to be able to have your second exercise or whatever other exercises are in sequence be
Hmm.
non-conflicting so that it is actually saving you time. If
Right.
you have two kind of quad focused exercises paired together, you're going to end up needing to rest between the two of them,
Right.
and or you're just damaging the effectiveness because you're carrying all this fatigue across. So usually I like to go like a lower body and an upper body, or like a push and a pull, or something that are kind of opposing each other.
To balance it out, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. First, your supersets. Do you usually do two exercises or do you kind of do three? Because I know sometimes, especially if people do group together different parts of the body, in terms of movement, I know sometimes people do like torso, then a lower and then an upper. Is it something that you do and recommend, or are we then getting too much into the whole fatigue, conversation?
Yeah, so something like that could be good as long as the torso or core exercise isn't like if you were doing a heavy squat or deadlift or something, you might not want to fatigue the core in between sets of that because the core plays such a big role
Right.
in like the
Bracing.
stability for the bracing and stability for the exercise. So that's
Right.
something you'd want to take into account. Um, but in general, like if what ends up happening actually, sorry, this is what I was going to say, is the
Yeah.
cardiovascular component, basically like just being out of breath or feeling like your heart's racing, that becomes the limiting factor when you've got all these exercises kind of like put back to back to back.
Yeah.
Um, so what ends up happening, as long as you're not conflicting muscle groups and you have like an upper and a lower, by the time you finish exercise number two, usually the muscles incorporated with the first one are pretty much ready to go. You just
Okay.
have to take into account like your heartbeat or your breathing rate or things like that, so that
Hmm.
you don't have all this cardiovascular kind of fatigue going into the
Hmm.
next set. So um, I find a lot of people struggle, especially if it's a very intense like strength session, actually
Right.
resting long enough to repeat the effort to begin with. So if uh, if you can kind of fill that space by doing something else,
Hmm.
you're checking the box of kind of like filling some time to allow the muscle to recover. You just then got to take into account that one pesky little thing of like, is my heart racing going into the
Yeah.
next round?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I know that you said that you're able to save time and you're able to actually fill up your rest time that you usually would have with other exercises. But then how do we apply this to rest times? Because obviously I'm assuming like we don't jump from superset to superset. I think that would just become a high interval, high
Mhm.
intensity interval training. But what type of rest do you recommend between a superset? Because obviously, the muscles need the rest too.
Yeah, that it's kind of a tricky question. I honestly, for a lot of people,
Hmm.
um, and it kind of depends on like the training experience and the
True.
basically the experience of the individual. But if someone spent a good amount of time in the gym, sometimes I'll just step back and be like, okay, like when you're ready to go, like when the heart rate's
Yeah,
down, get after it.
yeah, yeah. If
Um,
that's 30 seconds, if that's 60, if that's 90, like,
yeah,
yeah, makes sense.
it will depend a lot on what the exercises are. And for example,
Hmm.
sometimes if say you're doing a big exercise like you're doing like a trap bar deadlift that involves pretty
Hmm.
much the whole body. It's a very
Yeah,
intense exercise. Let's say you're doing
yeah,
low reps, so the weight's really heavy. And you're putting
right.
a lot into each set. Sometimes what I'll do is just put like a mobility exercise as the second part of the superset. And
Yeah.
then you're not taxing any muscle. You're not getting the heart
Hmm.
rate up. It is just rest, but there's a
That makes
task
a
to
lot of
do. It's
sense.
kind of like a coaching trick to be like,
Yeah.
you're not just sitting there resting, like you have something to do, but then
Hmm.
it forces you to not jump right back into the next set
Yeah.
before you're ready. So in that case, then you would just complete the other exercise and you're probably just good to jump back in.
Yeah.
But if just an athlete listening to this for their own training, if
Hmm.
um, that kind of setting where you're putting a lot into one set of an exercise, it is a good time to instead of just sitting on the bench or scrolling through Instagram or something, like if there's something that you know is tight or needs work from a mobility perspective, that's a really good opportunity to just get some extra reps to stretch something or, you
Hmm.
use it to be productive.
Yeah, 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 exactly. It's actually really good advice. And this kind of made me think because I was gonna ask you what you would recommend, for example, because as you mentioned, a barbell back squat or even the trap bar deadlift. Um, they both require some help from the lat.
Hmm.
And so I was gonna ask, like, because sometimes a lot of these compound movements they require help kind of from the same muscles, is it really smart to put all three heavy in a row? As you answered, no. The trick of the stretch is actually really interesting. It's really smart. And even I noticed it through one of the programs that one of the coaches at McMaster did.
Mm.
They put a lat stretch with the resistance band with the palm facing up. I remember the athletes were wondering, they were like, this actually doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like it's not really strength. But now, knowing what you just said, it
That's
actually makes a lot
probably
more
why it was
sense.
there. Yeah.
Yes, yes, there you go. And it actually makes a lot of sense because why would you tax out your system within the second exercise of your whole session? So,
And
yeah.
especially in a group setting, usually what happens if
Hmm.
you give a group a superset to do is it becomes just a circuit. Like once I finish A,
Yes, it
B, and
does.
C, then I go right to
Hmm.
A, and there's not
Exactly.
like a break in between.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so if the C of the equation is actually just rest, then
Yeah.
you don't even have to worry about that.
Yeah, yeah, and then I feel like it also is you're able to divide up the gym or the environment properly because maybe the first exercise at the squat rack, and then the second exercise can be done on the other part of the gym away from your group if this is happening with your team or if you're doing it in a busier gym, even at home. Um, but yeah, that's actually really helpful advice, and
100%.
I hope everybody's listening up and taking some notes.
Yes. Actually, I was going to mention a couple other superset situations.
Yeah,
So one, we talked a lot about here, um, taking
that thumbs up
the,
kills
I
me.
know, I know.
It always happens.
Uh, so we talked about not how to keep fatigue out of the superset.
Mhm.
And if you were in, say, like the early part of your off season, and it's more, as long as the program's kind of put together intelligently, usually it's more general in nature. You're not doing a lot of heavy strength or high
Right.
speed. It's more building a foundation and focusing on hypertrophy and like basic strength and things like that.
Hmm.
That could be a setting where maybe you intentionally shorten the superset or put a couple more intense things in a row where you are going to get your heart rate up. You are going to get a cardiovascular benefit because you're not giving
Hmm.
yourself the rest time.
Right.
And then you'll just come out of that with some general fitness that in line with the GPP general preparation. Um, that can be a useful tool. And then another way that I'll use these pairings sometimes is
Yeah.
for a potentiating factor. So, for example, if you were doing an explosive jump or sprint or something like that, to throw in something that's heavy, something high force, followed by something high speed, it can actually potentiate the nervous system to the extent that you actually get more force and more output from the fast thing. So that could be like a heavy trap bar deadlift into a jump,
Hmm.
where basically the movement is almost exactly the same. It's just
Yeah,
one
you just
is
deloaded.
yes, exactly. So that can be a tool that I use every once in a while for some athletic things like that.
Yeah, and that's super cool advice, and I'm sure that a lot of people listening are probably gonna use that into their sessions. So relating this to the second question that we'll be talking about today, the second topic, talking about specifically basketball. Jacob, I know that you worked with the basketball team at McMaster for how many years? Remind me.
The 1 year.
Awesome. So, with your background knowledge, what is some advice for conditioning or getting fit for the basketball season that can apply to a basketball athlete? And I guess just any athlete that has that type of similar game where there's so much running and it's just a continuous play.
Yeah, so first of all, kind of relaying off the last topic is
Yeah,
you can start in the early parts of the off season with some general fitness kind of stuff. And if you're able to do that, to just get a good aerobic base through running or cycling or something where,
hmm,
some long duration steady state, that can set a good foundation to make everything that comes after a lot easier. But if we're talking about kind of like the preseason or the late off season where you're really gearing up for competition, it's
right.
really important that the conditioning is specific. And if you look at the demands of the game, it's a very intense, it's filled with a lot of intense moments
Yeah.
and a lot of downtime.
Hmm.
Uh,
And it's continuous too.
Absolutely. So something that I think is interesting is I pulled this from Zach Couples is he gives his what he found was the work to rest ratio for a game of
Right.
basketball. And he said it's 1 to 4 to 5 for high to medium to low intensity actions. So
Hmm.
if uh, only one out of like 10% of the time is actually a high intense action, and 50% of the time is low intensity, like jogging, walking, standing,
Hmm.
um, doing anything that's just kind of like I think suicides are a great example where a coach will be like, "Oh, we're running 8 suicides," and it's just a
That's too traumatic
sprint
to hear.
for well, I know. Um, I've been there, but
Yeah.
it's like what you're asking is a max effort prolonged over however many minutes,
Hmm.
and a lot of coaches will look at that and be like, it's hard, so it's getting them prepared. They're going to be
Yeah.
conditioned and tough and blah, blah, blah. But what you want is something that's interval based, something where one, you have enough rest time to give a really high output because, um, because first of all, like if you're asked to do something for 5 minutes,
Right.
there's a certain intensity that you drop to that's below 100%.
Hmm.
And as
A
much
sub
as a
max.
coach, exactly, as much as a coach is yelling at you to go faster or do more, whatever, no person in the planet can
Yeah,
work at 100% of their output for multiple
exactly.
minutes at a time. It's not
Yeah.
physiologically possible.
It'll probably only be what, the first 10, 15 seconds, and then slowly
Exactly.
it'll just go
There's a drop
99,
off.
98, 95. Yeah.
And even better, if the athlete knows that this is going to be, say, a 2 minute task, it's
Yeah.
not like they're starting at 100 and dropping off with fatigue. The the brain, the body, it's intelligent. It'll
Yeah.
start at the regulated, like this is what I can sustain for this time period. And you're
No
probably
way. That's so
not
cool.
gonna ever get 100%.
That's super
So
cool.
yeah, and it's important to differentiate between 100% effort and 100% output. Because yes, you can give 100% effort for 30 minutes, and
Yeah.
that's what, runners do when they do their long run. It's usually like 100% effort, but
Like
it's
the best you can give is what you mean.
exactly. But
Cool.
output is regardless of, well, it requires 100% effort, but it also requires zero fatigue. Um, so if you want an athlete to hit a top speed or jump their max height, you can't ask them to do it 50 times in a row. Is
Yeah,
you
that's
like
true.
you can't have both.
They're gonna get
So
physiologically tired, mentally tired, all of it.
exactly. So conditioning should have exposure to high intensity actions like top speed sprinting and jumping with breaks in between. And maybe you try to mimic that 1 to 4 to 5 kind of ratio. Maybe it's a max effort 3/4 court sprint to a walk to like a defensive shuffle to like, and you put enough rest in between where you can actually put effort into the fast
Yeah,
parts. And then if you can accumulate time and repetition, and maybe the progression is you slowly decrease the rest intervals so that maybe towards the end of your conditioning work, as you get closer and closer to the season, maybe
right.
you're at shorter rest intervals than even what the game's going to ask for.
Hmm.
Um, but one, I don't think that's a good place to start. And it's a
You have to build
progression.
up to it. Exactly.
Exactly. So the other component of this is I have always thought that playing was one of the best ways to condition because you
Right.
get the work to
It's
rest
sport
ratios.
specific.
It's the most playing the sport is as specific to
Yeah,
preparing for the sport as you can get.
exactly.
And because you get all the same actions, the running, the jumping, the dribbling, the cutting, the defending, you get it all. It's as specific as it can get. But as another thing from Zach Couples is
Hmm.
playing in a scrimmage or, even whether that's with the team or with your friends or whatever, it's almost never going to be the same intensity as a game just because there's different motivations and incentives and
Yeah,
e-
different environmental
everyone's
factors.
everyone's probably playing in slightly lower of a gear.
Yeah, totally. There's
So
less pressure. Everything's different.
exactly. So as much as playing is probably the best way to condition yourself, uh, it should be accounted for that it's probably not enough. And that's where, and this, I think I mentioned this before, but this is where soccer does things so well,
Hmm.
is the utilization of small-sided games, where you're actually overloading situations relative to what you see in a game.
Right.
So
Yeah, what's an
potentially,
example?
yeah, so potentially if you're doing some skill training on court and you've got maybe a couple teammates or a couple friends that you can do this with, doing something like a 3v3 where you actually shrink the court, or maybe you only
Hmm.
have from like midline over to the corner and you're working with basically a quarter of the court
Right.
and it closes the space, which pushes all the players together, which means you get more frequency of actions um, than you would see in a game. Because when things are more spread out, that's where that 50% of the game being low intensity comes from. Is
Yeah.
the the space, the size of
Yeah.
everything. When the ball's
And
over in
also
that
the
corner, you
fatigue.
get to stand. Exactly.
Yeah.
So creating environments and situations through games like that where you're actually asked to do more than what the game demands, then one, it's really good for like fast decision making and the actual skill component and IQ component of the game, but it's
Hmm.
also asking a lot of the body. Um, and that's where the conditioning stuff comes in. So
Yeah.
those would be my recommendations.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really good advice, especially because I feel like sometimes coaches, as you mentioned, with the suicide, they kind of just say, yep, that must be the most efficient way to condition them because it's repetitive, it's really, really fast. Um, but I think, yeah, what a lot of people are forgetting then is the fatigue aspect. And as we talked about also in previous episodes, fatigue is one of the biggest enemies when it comes to training efficiently. And I think, especially through conditioning, would you even ever put a team through a conditioning session that's exhausting? Like, of course, conditioning is going to be tiring. Like, by the end of it, your athletes should be like, okay, that was work. But would you ever make it exhausting to the point where, like, they're, panting and sweating buckets?
So I would, because that's where when we talk about fatigue and how it
Hmm.
how it kind of ruins things for you. That's pretty much for every like mostly speed, power, strength-based things.
Like in
Um,
gym lift sessions, not necessarily like building the
right.
endurance.
Right. Uh and so we're clear, the on-court stuff, I think a lot of skill development, this also applies.
Hmm.
Um, where if you are running yourself into the ground, you're probably not also improving your jump shot and your ball handling abilities. Like you're probably not doing both at the same time.
Yeah.
So if we are just talking about conditioning though, then you should be challenging your cardiovascular system. You should be breathing heavy and sweating hard, and because that's kind of the outcome of challenging yourself
Hmm.
in that way.
Hmm. So it's one of the training styles where you actually do want to see that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, there we go. Good to know. And all right, so let's get to the last and third question. So this is again, as I said before, more related to speed, agility, and quickness. Speed is such an important factor in so many sports, but specifically, what are some of the biggest contributors to speed and the lowest hanging fruit for becoming faster?
Yeah. So this is probably one of the more under prioritized topics. If you look at just kind of like what goes around social media and things like that, I feel like this is an important one. When it comes
Yeah.
to getting faster, you need force development abilities, which is basically strength.
Hmm.
Uh, you need a high rate of force development, which means being able to produce that force fast. Um, you need to be able to produce that force horizontally, which is where a lot of the technique work comes in. Because usually poor sprint technique just leads to more force going straight into the ground as opposed to propelling you forward.
Yeah, propelling you forward. Yeah, makes sense.
Um, and then you need a fast limb speed, which is kind of related to like rate of force development and things like that. But if you get all the other boxes checked, but you can't switch over your legs really fast, then that'll just become the limiting factor.
Right.
Um, Now, the thing I see the most often is, especially in younger athletes,
Hmm.
the hip flexor and kind of like the calf Achilles foot complex are just not prepped and ready to get into proper sprint positions. Like if
Hmm.
you can't hop on one foot without your heel kind of like collapsing into the ground every time, then you certainly don't have the stiffness required to hit the
To
ground
propel
at
yourself
high
forward.
speeds
Yeah.
and actually be efficient and effective with the sprint in this way. So, and then on the hip flexor side of things, if you can't pull your knee to, hip height and actually keep the leg in that position without compromising like spinal part, like usually if you ask someone to lift their knee up, their background's forward and they kind of do all these other things to create that position.
Yeah. To try and compensate
And
almost.
exactly. So if you can't create the position, that's red flag number one. And
Hmm.
then the second point to that is once you can create the position, uh, the hip flexor has to be really strong because the knee comes forward with so much force, and a lot of the not not a not a lot of the force, but there's a good percentage of the force that's propelling you forward that comes from drive of the knee
Yeah. And
alongside the
driving
push
forward.
off the ground.
Hmm.
Um, so if that hip flexor isn't strong enough or explosive enough, then you're missing something huge there. So
Hmm.
with a lot of younger athletes, the biggest thing that they need, I would say number one is that calf Achilles foot stiffness, um, which I think comes from one, just making sure you have enough baseline strength through calf raises and barefoot work and things like that
And
to
like
just
doing like
have
single leg balance work, single leg
that could
loading
be a
type of
factor
things.
too, 100%.
Okay.
Um, And then once there's some baseline strength there, doing some hopping, some pogo hops, some
Yeah.
bounding, some things where you're challenging the ability of the foot to stay stiff when it hits the ground and not have the heel kind of drop towards the floor as
Yeah,
soon
and
as
like
the foot hits.
collapse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you can do that at a high level, that's going to translate huge to your sprinting abilities. And then I think the
Hmm.
hip flexor stuff would come second to that, making sure you can get up in that position. And I think one thing that would be a good kind of test or challenge is if you can
Yeah.
put your back flat against a wall, have a hand in like the low part of your back to make sure
Hmm.
that you have a small curve there and you're not rounding it forward.
Yeah, and hunching
Uh,
forward.
and then to lift a leg, lift your knee up in front of you and see how high you can get it before your back leaves the wall, or your hand gets pushed away, or like something
That's really
compensates.
helpful.
I
Right.
bet a lot of people would struggle to get horizontal with the knee
Hmm.
without something moving around the spine. And if that's the case, there's probably some benefits doing some work there, alongside some general strength, then, like I said, contributing to that propulsion of the knee going forward.
Hmm.
Um, but alongside that, then with all the other factors, like
Hmm.
I would say that would be the biggest low-hanging fruit.
Hmm.
But then getting stronger uh, is usually also the lowest hanging fruit, especially the younger that you go, the more force you can
Yeah.
produce, that's going to translate the most. Um, and then you kind of stack on top of that the rate of force development. So
Hmm.
then you get into kind of like power-based exercises, so moving kind of a smaller, moderate load as fast as you can. And then the technique stuff gets quite challenging, especially to explain
Yeah.
over audio like this. But
It's very technical.
yes, but I think one of the things that's usually missing is like the low projection angle, especially in acceleration, where you want
Hmm.
my favorite line is your shin is your steering wheel. So the deeper your shin angle gets, most likely the faster you'll be accelerating.
Hmm.
And then that gets a little nuance because once you get up to top speed, you're more taller, there's less of that angle, and
Yeah.
that's less true.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, maybe the specifics of sprint technique is a little beyond the scope of what we can do here.
Hmm. And so I know that you said that this is more applied to younger athletes, so literally younger like kids. Would you then recommend them actually starting sprinting mechanics, drills with these technicals earlier on? Or maybe would you focus on teaching them what A's are, what B's are, what type of angle their shin should be, how to land properly, even maybe like the arm swing? Like, would you break it down until you think that they've developed the right amount of strength and they're at the, I guess, quote unquote, more appropriate age, or just, a little bit more experienced with athletics? Or do you still think there's some benefit to them still doing sprinting drills and adding that at the end of the sessions?
Yeah, I think there I'm reminded of my favorite line from Spina from the FRC kind of group
Hmm.
that's so stupidly simple, but it's you can't move where you can't move.
Yeah.
And like I was talking about with the hip flexor thing, lifting the knee up, if you're trying to teach an athlete like an A position or these certain speed technique kind of exercises and they can't get in those positions, then what are you training? Like what's
Hmm.
actually going on with this exercise? And it's it's certainly better than nothing because at least you're
Yeah.
challenging them to get to like you might see some slow progress towards getting into these shapes, but certainly not as fast progress as you'd see if you just focused on them directly in other aspects. Um, so I think it kind of depends on the developmental stage, but
Hmm.
if we're talking like young athletes, they should probably be isolating these specific factors like the strength and the
Yeah.
specific movement,
The landing.
and then just running
Yeah.
because
Yeah. Just true. Makes
yeah,
sense.
because it would be completely unrealistic to say you don't start sprinting until you've achieved X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
because especially if they're in a sport, they're going out and they're running around anyways. Like that would be a
What
silly
whether they
limitation
know
to
the
put.
proper technique or not, they're running
Right. So if
in and outside of the sport.
yeah, so if you can, set up some competitive environments where, I love doing like a chase drill, where
Yes,
you got
they
someone
always
trying to
work.
catch you. That's a great way to get those good outputs that we were talking about. Um,
Yes.
but if you just create these competitive environments that challenge them to move fast, and then you're also working on the tissue quality and the movement quality, and then gradually working to the technique, that would be the key, I think. But I'll say this, I've seen a lot of uh, older, mature athletes that are lacking some of these like basic uh, components. Like,
Really?
well, I know it's
Ha-
tough for say like an 18-year-old to be like,
yeah.
oh, I don't need the same strength development that the 13-year-old needs. Like I'm past that. But if you've never actually done it or you haven't done it properly or
You haven't focused on it.
yeah, then a lot of times that's step one. Like you don't have the requisite strength to and stability to get into these positions.
Mhm.
So I know you see all your peers doing all this crazy stuff, or you see these professional athletes doing all these things, but there's such a big foundation under that.
Mhm.
And just because that's where like the training age conversation comes in, because just because you are a certain age doesn't mean you're also at a certain that train an equal
Yeah.
training age. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. There's not like a direct value where like you're 18 years old and you're automatically this training age. Like you still have to go through all the process, all the stages, and actually put in the work to like build your way up. That makes sense.
exactly. And I was a great example of that because I never started playing sport. I never even started playing sports till I was 13, which is
Me
quite a
too.
bit later than a lot of other
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. It's
Um,
later in middle school. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then I certainly didn't start strength training till years after that, and then
Hmm.
didn't start strength training properly till years after that. So,
Yeah.
uh,
It took quite a few years.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think that ends today's conversation about speed, agility, quickness, some basketball conditioning tips and advice, as well as the importance of supersets. Thank you again, Jacob, for such a good episode. We covered so many cool topics. And guys, make sure to tune in next week for episode 6. We'll see you guys then.
absolutely.
Bye.
See ya.